The theater was dark, its shadows stretching like silent predators across the aisles. The only light came from the flickering glow of the massive screen, where metallic giants clashed in a cacophony of sound. The air was thick with the scent of buttered popcorn and sugary soda, an intoxicating mix of nostalgia and indulgence. This was supposed to be an ordinary first date, fun, lighthearted, and maybe a little awkward. Instead, it became a story that would haunt me forever. I had met her just a few weeks prior, a whirlwind connection that led us here, sharing a bucket of popcorn and a bag of toffees during Transformers. We sat 3 rows from the front, close enough for the screen to swallow us whole. I forgot my glasses that night, so I was squinting and struggling to focus as my retina burned from the proximity. She, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease, enjoying her sweet and salted popcorn with carefree abandon. Then it happened. At first it was a soft cough, barely audible over the roaring explosions on screen. I glanced at her, a polite smile tugging at my lips. Another cough followed, this one sharper, more strained. "You okay?" I whispered. She nodded, her face flushed but her eyes watering. I thought maybe she had swallowed a bit of popcorn the wrong way. No big deal, right? But then the coughing turned into choking. Her hands flew to her throat, her eyes wide with panic as her breaths came in desperate, ragged gasps. My heart stopped. I froze, unsure of what to do. The world around us dissolved into muffled chaos. Other moviegoers began to notice, heads turning toward us in confusion. The screen blared on, indifferent to the terror unfolding in its glow. "Stand up," I stammered, pulling her to her feet. I remembered seeing something on TV, some maneuver to help people when they're choking. I stood behind her, my arms fumbling around her torso, and began squeezing just below her ribs. She bent forward, her body convulsing as she struggled to dislodge whatever was blocking her airway. Nothing worked. Her gasps turned weaker. Her face, once flushed, was now turning an alarming shade of purple. My mind raced. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know if I was helping or making things worse. The theater was now in complete disarray. A few people hurried toward us, their faces a mixture of concern and panic. Someone shouted to call 911. Another person bolted to get the theater's first aid staff. "We have to get her out of here," someone yelled. A group of strangers helped carry her into the dimly lit hallway outside the theater. The movie's deafening explosions were muffled as the door slammed shut behind us. My date was now barely conscious, her body limp but still clinging to life. I felt helpless, useless. That's when an older man stepped forward. He didn't waste a second. He lifted her arms above her head and performed a maneuver I had never seen before, applying pressure to her abdomen in quick, calculated thrusts. It worked. A few chunks of popcorn shot from her mouth, landing on the carpeted floor. She gasped, sucking in air with a sound that was both horrifying and relieving. Her face, once purple, began regaining color. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she collapsed into a heap, coughing and trembling but alive. I dropped to my knees beside her, my own hands shaking uncontrollably. She looked at me with a weak smile, her voice barely above a whisper. "Guess I'm not dying on a first date," she rasped, trying to laugh but wincing instead. We both laughed about it later, once the terror subsided. That night, though, I couldn't shake the thought of how close I had come to losing her. What if the older man hadn't been there? What if I had panicked even more? What if the popcorn had been lodged just a little tighter? It's been years since that night. She's my fiancée now, and we still joke about how she almost met her end during Transformers. When we tell people the story, we laugh. About the ridiculousness of choking on popcorn, about how utterly useless I was, and about the old man who swooped in like a hero from a movie of his own. But late at night, when the world is quiet and my mind drifts, I remember the shadowed theater, her pale face, and the sound of her gasping for air. I remember how fragile life is, how quickly things can go wrong, And I remember the lesson I learned that night. Sometimes, the simplest of things, like a piece of popcorn, can bring us face to face with death. I sat at the small table, my hands fidgeting with the edge of the napkin in my lap. My stomach churned, not just from hunger, but from the familiar nerves that accompanied first dates. It had been months since I last ventured into the treacherous waters of dating, and now here I was, anxiously waiting. It all started a few weeks ago. Bored and a little lonely, I decided to try my luck on a dating app. Not one of the big ones like Tinder or Bumble. I hated the thought of sifting through an endless stream of messages. Instead, I opted for a smaller app, one that boasted a modest 100,000 downloads. It felt quieter, more intimate, a place where I could escape the overwhelming flood of attention that came with the larger platforms. That's where I met Johnny. He wasn't the most conventionally attractive guy I'd ever seen, but there was something about his pictures that drew me in. His dark, spiked hair, his chiseled jawline, and his smile. Perfect teeth that seemed too white to be natural. He described himself as a 5'10", 200-pound gym enthusiast with a love for classic rock and Italian food. His profile was fully filled out, down to the little details most people skipped. He seemed real, genuine. And for the first time in ages, I let myself feel a flicker of excitement. After chatting for a couple of weeks, Johnny suggested we meet in person. We agreed on a casual dinner at a Chinese restaurant downtown. He even called ahead to make a reservation. His effort impressed me, and despite the nagging apprehension I always felt before meeting someone new, I found myself looking forward to it. The night of the date, I arrived at the restaurant 5 minutes early. The hostess led me to a small, dimly lit table near the back. I was grateful for the semi-private spot. It felt less intimidating than being in the center of the bustling room. As I waited, I skimmed through the menu, pretending to deliberate even though I'd already decided on my dish. Minutes ticked by. 7 o'clock came and went. My eyes darted to the entrance every time the door swung open, but Johnny was nowhere to be seen. By 7:10, I was starting to feel self-conscious. Was I being stood up? Just as the thought crossed my mind, the door opened again, and there he was. But something was off. Johnny didn't look like his pictures. He wasn't 5'10". He barely looked my height, 5'6" on a good day. His build was less muscular than his photos suggested, and his complexion seemed paler, almost sickly under the restaurant's soft lighting. Still, I told myself not to judge. People exaggerated online all the time. He approached the table with a hesitant smile, and I stood to greet him. Awkwardly, we exchanged a hug and a quick kiss on the cheek. His cologne was strong, almost overpowering, and as I sat back down, I noticed his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his chair. The first few minutes of conversation were painful. Johnny was stiff, his answers clipped and shallow. His leg bounced incessantly under the table, the rhythmic tapping against the floor grating on my nerves. I tried to chalk it up to first date jitters, but his demeanor was unnerving. He avoided eye contact, his gaze flitting between his hands and the menu. When the waitress came to take our drink order, I breathed a small sigh of relief. At least the food would give us something to focus on. We ordered drinks, appetizers, and our mains, and for a while the meal provided a welcome distraction. But as the night wore on, Johnny's behavior became stranger. His legs bouncing grew more frantic, causing the table to vibrate. He avoided looking directly at me, his eyes darting around the room or locking onto his plate. He seemed on edge, like he was waiting for something. Halfway through the main course, I excused myself to use the restroom. Grabbing my purse, I made my way to the back of the restaurant, grateful for the brief escape. In the brightly lit bathroom, I took a moment to collect myself, reapplying my lipstick and smoothing down my dress. Something about Johnny was unsettling, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. When I returned to the table, everything changed. As I approached, I noticed a woman at a nearby table watching me intently. She was older, with short grey hair and piercing blue eyes. She stood abruptly as I reached my seat, cutting me off before I could sit down. "Excuse me," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Can I speak to you for a moment?" Startled, I glanced at Johnny, who was now staring down at his plate, his face expressionless. The woman didn't wait for my response. She grabbed my arm gently but firmly and gestured for me to follow her outside. "What's going on?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice. She didn't answer until we were outside the restaurant, the door swinging shut behind us. "Your drink," she said, holding up the glass of wine I'd left on the table. Her hands trembled as she poured the contents into a nearby planter. I saw him put something in it, a tablet. It fizzed and dissolved in seconds. My blood ran cold. "What?" "There's no time to explain," she said, her eyes darting toward the restaurant's entrance. "You need to get out of here. Now. He's dangerous." I felt paralyzed, my mind racing as I tried to process her words. Before I could respond, the woman shoved me toward the shop next door, a small convenience store with bright fluorescent lighting. "Go inside," she said. "Call the police. I'll handle him." Still in shock, I stumbled into the store, the harsh lights making me feel exposed and vulnerable. The shopkeeper, a middle-aged man with a kind face, noticed my distress immediately. "Are you all right?" he asked. "A man," I stammered. He tried to spike my drink. He might be following me." The shopkeeper's expression hardened. Without a word, he led me to the back room and locked the door behind me. "Use the phone," he said, pointing to an old landline on the desk. "Call 911. I dialed with shaking hands, my voice barely steady enough to relay the situation to the operator. As I spoke, I could hear muffled voices outside the store. The woman was confronting Johnny, her tone firm and unyielding. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. When they finally did, I was escorted outside to give my statement. Johnny was gone. He'd fled before the officers arrived. The woman told them what she had seen, but without Johnny's real name or address, there was little they could do. The dating app couldn't track him, and the CCTV footage from the restaurant wasn't clear enough to identify him. For weeks after, I lived in a state of fear, constantly looking over my shoulder. The experience had shaken me to my core, leaving me unable to trust anyone. The woman who saved me never gave me her name, disappearing into the night like some kind of guardian angel. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that Johnny is still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting, and I'll never know how close I came to becoming his victim. The haunting reality of what could have happened still lingers with me. It's a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurk beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary encounters. I haven't been on a date since, and I'm not sure I ever will again. The shadows of that night follow me, whispering their warnings. Trust no one, stay vigilant, and never, ever let your guard down. In 2014, I was 19, caught in a liminal space between adolescence and adulthood. Home felt like a war zone, a battleground of endless arguments between my mum and dad. The walls of our house seemed to tremble with their shouting matches, vibrating with the weight of words unspoken for years. It wasn't a home, it was a prison, and I was desperate to escape. I spent my days devising ways to stay away, friends' houses, sleepovers that stretched across entire weekends, or even hotel stays when I could scrape together enough cash. Dates, however, were the easiest out. They offered a convenient excuse to be gone without facing too many questions. That's how I found myself agreeing to a date with Matt, a guy I'd met at a bowling alley. He was easygoing, funny, and had this effortless charm that made me feel comfortable. We exchanged numbers, texted for a few days, and quickly made plans for a low-key evening, just two teens hanging out without any grand expectations. The plan? Grab snacks from Walmart and take them to the park nearby. It wasn't fancy, but it sounded like a much-needed break from my chaotic home life. Matt picked me up in his truck, a faded relic of the 90s that roared like a lion but sputtered like a sick cat at stoplights. We joked about its quirks as we drove to Walmart. The atmosphere was light-hearted, almost playful, as we roamed the fluorescent aisles, tossing chips, soda, and candy into the cart. Once stocked up, we headed to the park. It wasn't a big park, just a clearing with a skate bowl, a few benches, and a playground that seemed eerily out of place in the dark. The moon hung low, its pale glow washing over the empty space, casting long shadows that danced with the breeze. We climbed up the edge of the skate bowl and let our legs dangle over the side. I tore into a bag of Cheetos, and Matt cracked open a can of soda. The silence was comforting at first, broken only by the crunch of chips and the occasional fizz of his drink. For a while it felt like we were the only two people in the world. But then, the mood shifted. A faint rustling sound came from the bushes behind us. At first I barely noticed it, brushing it off as the wind. But it came again, louder this time, distinctly different from the soft whispers of leaves swaying in the breeze. Matt paused mid-sip, his head snapping toward the noise. "Matt, probably just a stray cat," he said, his voice steady but his eyes scanning the darkness. I wanted to believe him, but something about the sound felt wrong, too deliberate, too heavy. We sat frozen, our snack session forgotten. The rustling stopped as abruptly as it had started. An oppressive silence settled over the park, broken only by the distant chirp of crickets. I clutched the bag of chips, my fingers trembling as I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Then it started again, closer this time. Matt's eyes widened as he leaned forward, squinting into the gloom. "Matt, I think I saw something," he whispered. His voice was barely audible, but the urgency in his tone sent a shiver down my spine. "What did you see?" I asked, my throat dry. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up, grabbing his half-full soda can. In one swift motion, he hurled it into the bushes where the sound had come from. The can hit something with a metallic clang before falling to the ground. Silence. No scurrying. No startled animal darting away. Just nothing. "Let's go," I urged, my voice shaking. I didn't care if it was a raccoon, a prankster, or some creep lurking in the shadows. I didn't want to stick around to find out. We gathered our things quickly, stuffing the snacks into Matt's bag. The parking lot was only a short walk away, and I could see the faint outline of his truck under the dim streetlights. Relief washed over me as we approached the vehicle, but that relief was short-lived. Matt froze mid-step, his eyes locked on something behind me. "Matt, don't! Turn around," he whispered, his voice trembling. But of course I turned. Standing at the edge of the bushes was a figure dressed in a clown costume. The garish colors of the outfit seemed out of place against the dark backdrop, but it was the machete in his hand that sent my heart plummeting. The blade was long, gleaming in the moonlight, and streaked with what looked like dried blood. I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot as my brain screamed at me to run. The clown didn't move either. He just stood there, staring at us with an intensity that felt almost inhuman. Matt snapped out of his shock first. "Get in the truck," he yelled, fumbling with his keys. His hands were shaking so badly that he struggled to fit the key into the lock. I crouched behind the truck, my eyes darting back to the clown. He hadn't moved a muscle, but his presence was suffocating, like a predator toying with its prey. Finally, Matt managed to unlock the door. He yanked it open and reached into the glove box, pulling out a handgun. Without hesitation, he aimed at the clown and fired. The first shot rang out, echoing through the empty park. The clown flinched, stumbling back into the bushes. Matt fired 2 more rounds, his hands shaking as he yelled, "Matt, stay the hell away from us." The clown disappeared into the darkness, and Matt stopped shooting. He tossed the gun back into the glove box, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. "Matt, get in," he said, his voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I scrambled into the passenger seat, slamming the door shut as Matt started the truck. The engine roared to life, and he floored it, speeding out of the parking lot like a bat out of hell. For the first few minutes, we didn't speak. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional screech of tires as Matt ran stop signs and ignored red lights. My hands were trembling so badly that I had to press them against my thighs to keep them still. Then, in the rearview mirror, I saw it. Headlights. At first I thought it was just another car, but then I noticed how erratically it was driving, swerving, speeding up, and then falling back as if taunting us. "It's him," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Matt glanced in the mirror, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the steering wheel. "Hold on," he said, slamming his foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward, the engine straining as we sped down the deserted road. The headlights behind us grew brighter, closer. My heart felt like it was going to explode. After what felt like an eternity, Matt made a sharp turn onto a narrow side road, killing the headlights as we barreled down the gravel path. The truck bumped and jolted, but he didn't slow down. Finally, he pulled off to the side, cutting the engine. We sat in complete darkness, the only sound our labored breathing. The headlights passed by a few moments later, the vehicle speeding down the main road without noticing us. We waited, too terrified to move, until we were sure the clown, or whoever was behind the wheel, was gone. Matt drove me home in silence, his hands still trembling on the wheel. When we finally pulled into my driveway, he turned to me, his face pale and eyes hollow. "I'm sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have brought you there." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. My body felt numb, my mind replaying the night over and over like a broken record. As I stepped out of the truck, I glanced back at Matt. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He gave me a weak smile before driving off, leaving me standing alone in the dim light of the porch. That night I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the clown, his lifeless gaze boring into me, the blood-stained machete gleaming in the moonlight. Years later, I still don't know who or what that clown was. A deranged man? A figment of our imaginations fueled by fear? Or something worse, something unexplainable? All I know is that the terror of that night has never left me. It lingers in the shadows of my mind, a constant reminder that sometimes the monsters we fear are all too real.